weren't bones. They were breathing. In the blistering heat of Nevada's Desolation Ridge, State Ranger Elena Marlowe thought she had seen the worst the desert could do until she stumbled upon two shallow graves still shifting with life. Hooves twitching, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with something far more human than fear. What she unearthed that day was not just a crime against nature, but the first crack in a silence someone would kill to keep buried. Because these Mustangs weren't just wild, they were made. And they weren't the only ones. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The sun was a white-hot coin nailed to the sky, baking the land until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Out here in the endless flats of Nevada's Desolation Ridge, the heat didn't just press against your skin, it crawled into your lungs, turned every breath into work. The temperature was already hovering close to 110, and it wasn't yet noon. The wind carried sand and grit in long, slow gusts from the west, whistling over the jagged lip of the ridge. When it hit the stone outcrops, it moaned in a way that could unsettle even seasoned rangers low and hollow, like something half alive, trapped in the rocks. To a casual glance, the desert looked mute and dead. But Ellie Marlowe knew better. She'd seen life thrive here in the strangest forms, prickly pear blossoms bursting blood red in the middle of nothing, sidewinders tracing perfect signatures in the dust, the glint of a raven's eye on a power line. It was all here if you looked long enough. Ellie adjusted the strap of her pack, the canvas of her dark green uniform sticking to the small of her back. Her sunglasses hid the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, but not the way she scanned the horizon in short, precise sweeps. The pistol at her hip was regulation, the water bottle at her belt nearly empty. Her boots were caked with the dust of a dozen patrols. She was the only ranger on this stretch of land today, a patch of Mustang preserve that rolled out for miles in every direction. The assignment was routine in theory, urgent in practice. A low-flying survey plane had reported unidentified movement in the valley just after midnight. That was unusual enough to warrant a closer look, especially in summer, when the Mustangs tended to stay near water and out of the open flats. And for Ellie, every sighting, every anomaly carried a private weight. 2 years ago, she'd been one step too late. A band of wild horses had been herded loaded into an unmarked truck and gone without a trace. She'd found hoof prints in the sand and nothing else. That failure still woke her some nights. She dropped her gaze to the ground ahead as she crested a low rise, the wind shoving at her back. The flat stretched before her in a pale expanse broken only by scattered yucca and the occasional mesquite. That's when she noticed it, a disturbance subtle at first, then undeniable. The earth here was wrong. A long, uneven gouge cut across the surface, trailing toward the basin below. It wasn't the narrow track of a lizard or the soft scatter left by a jackrabbit. This was wider, deeper, as if something large and heavy had been dragged the sand, piling up in ridges along the edges. Ellie crouched, her hand brushing over the grooves. Their half-moon indentations overlapping at odd angles. Hoof prints, not the crisp, forward-moving kind. These were jumbled, clawed into the ground, like the animal had been thrashing or trying to push itself free. She scanned ahead. A yucca bush lay flattened, its stalk snapped leaves bent in a ragged fan. The damage was fresh. Then she heard it. A sound so faint she thought at first it was the wind playing tricks. A hiss or a sigh just under the pitch of hearing. She tilted her head, pulling the sunglasses down to listen harder. The noise came again, shorter, sharper this time, almost like breathing. Not above the ground, below it. She stood still, pulse ticking faster. There were explanations for noises in the sand rodents, burrowing a snake, moving through the loose top layer, even the wind funneling into a hollow. But this was none of those. It repeated with an irregular rhythm, shallow and strained, as if whoever or whatever made it was running out of air. Ellie dropped to her knees, pressing her palm flat against the warm grit. The faint tremor beneath her hand sent a jolt up her arm. She began to dig. The top layer was dry and powdery, but beneath it, the sand clumped together in damp, heavy handfuls. Her fingers hit something almost at once, something slick and warm under the grit. She yanked her hand back, breath caught in her throat, then pushed forward again, clearing more away. A tuft of hair emerged, short, coarse, and ash gray. She uncovered more in frantic strokes until the shape resolved into a twitching ear crusted with sand. And then an eye wide and rolling the sclera bright against the darkness of the iris. It was a horse's eye, and it was alive. Oh hell, she breathed. The animal made a desperate muffled sound through flared nostrils, its head jerking as far as the packed earth would allow. Ellie's mind went taut and narrow. She scraped away at the sand with both hands, the heat burning her palms. Ash, she murmured without thinking, a name pulled from the color of its coat. Easy. I've got you. Ash's neck trembled under the pressure of the sand. He was buried nearly to the base of the skull, his chest pinned. The panic in his eye was sharp enough to cut. Ellie slapped at the radio on her shoulder. Ranger Marlowe requesting immediate static drowned the words, the line crackling with useless white noise. She turned her head, tried again. Emergency response, Desolation Ridge sector, nothing. The signal was gone. Cursing under her breath, she pulled the short emergency shovel from the pack on her back. Sand was shifting toward the hollow she'd made, threatening to fill it again. She dug faster, scooping and throwing, feeling the burn in her shoulders. The movement stirred something else. Another lump in the sand beside Ash. At first, she thought it was more of his body, but then the hair color registered pale, almost gold like dune grass in the sun, and the shape. She dug toward it, and the mound resolved into another muzzle limp against the earth. This one's eyes were closed, the lashes dusted with grit. A weak exhale brushed against her wrist. Dune, she whispered, naming him before she could stop herself. He wasn't thrashing. He wasn't moving at all, save for the faint rise and fall of his breath. Blood, just a scatter of droplets, speckled the sand near his nostrils. Ellie's throat tightened. She wedged the small shovel into the packed sand around his neck, careful not to jolt him. Every second she lost the heat was pulling more life from them. She splashed water from her canteen to soften the earth, ignoring how fast the bottle emptied. The work was brutal, digging bracing, sliding the board from her kit under Dune's head to keep it from lolling when the sand gave way. Ash was stronger. Every time she freed a little more of him, he heaved upward in bursts that threatened to collapse the walls of the hole. Easy, easy. She panted, one arm braced against his shoulder. You fight too hard, you bury yourself again. Minutes or hours, she couldn't tell later. Both horses' heads and necks were free. Sweat ran down her face, stinging her eyes. Her hands were raw. She paused, breathing hard, and took stock. Ash's chest was still buried to the sternum. Dune's breathing was shallow, almost silent. She could see the tremor in Ash's muscles, the way his ears flicked toward sounds she couldn't hear. She forced herself to look away from them and scan the surrounding ground. If they'd been buried here, someone had put them here, and maybe left something else behind. 100 feet away, the dirt track broke from the main trail, two deep ruts gouged into the hardpan and the tread pattern heavy squared off. Military or industrial tires. She followed them with her eyes to where they disappeared behind a rise. Closer at the base of a mesquite, something black caught the light. She crossed to it and knelt. A length of insulated electrical cable lay half-buried, its end, sheared clean, folded back on itself like it had been wrenched free. Near her boot was the glint of glass. She pinched it between her fingers. A hypodermic barrel snapped in two, the broken tip still wet with a resin-colored smear. She slipped it into an evidence pouch from her kit. Then something stranger, a perfect small circle in the sand, maybe 2 inches across. Not a shoe print, not random. She brushed away the loose grit and saw the faint scorch mark around it, as if a heated horseshoe had been pressed there briefly. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of something sharp and metallic. She dug a few inches into the sand beneath the circle and found the grains darker clumped. Fluid had seeped here recently, blood, water, or some chemical she didn't want to guess at. Her stomach knotted. Whoever had done this hadn't intended for either horse to be found alive, which meant this might not be the only burial site. She went back to them. Both were still breathing, but the heat was winning. She fetched the folding plank from her vehicle and eased Dune onto it first, covering him with a shock blanket from her kit. Then Ash, reluctant eyes still rolling, until both were out of the pits. Their hides were hot under her hands, their sides heaving. She checked their pulse points, rapid thready. Severe dehydration, heat stress, possible internal injury. And she was still alone, still without a working radio. Ellie crouched between them, her own shadow stretching long in the cruel sun. She slid an arm under Dune's neck, speaking low, steady. "I don't know who did this to you," she said. "But if they wanted to bury you..." Her eyes cut toward the horizon where the ruts vanished. They buried the wrong damn horses. The drive back to the station was 12 miles of washboard road, each rut jarring up through the wheel into Ellie's arms. She kept the all-terrain vehicle steady, but fast, the folded rescue plank, rattling behind her with its precious cargo. Ash and Dune lay on it side by side, secured with canvas straps, their heads angled toward her in the rear-view mirror. The shock blankets reflected what little heat they had left back into their bodies. Every time Dune's chest stuttered under the blanket, she clenched her jaw harder. The ranger station wasn't much, just a squat, sun-bleached building, squatting alone in a patch of gravel and scrub, with a metal radio mast and a separate shed for the diesel generator. Out here, there was no cell coverage. The power came from the generator, the water from a tank and pump system, the heat from whatever you could burn in winter. Tonight, the place was going to be a lifeboat. She backed the vehicle under the lean-to and cut the engine. The silence roared. Ash shifted under the straps, nostrils, flaring eyes rolling white. Dune lay still except for a faint twitch in one hind leg. There was no proper livestock stall here, no padded recovery pen. The best she could offer was the auxiliary storage room that still smelled faintly of hay from an old supply run. She kicked the sliding door open and dragged out what she needed: bales of straw to soften the concrete, a layer of sand from the pile outside to keep it from getting slick. One by one, she freed them from the plank and eased them onto the makeshift bed. Ash tried to stand immediately, legs buckling under his own weight. She pressed a firm hand to his shoulder, guiding him back down. "Easy," she murmured. "You're not going anywhere." The routine came back to her in muscle memory. A damp cloth for their eyes, wiping away the grit. A length of surgical tubing and a plastic funnel trickling water slowly into their mouths so they wouldn't choke. Iodine spray over the worst of the abrasions, the sting making Ash flinch and snort, making Dune's lips quiver against her palm. Ash's breathing steadied first, though he kept shaking his head in short, sharp bursts, as if trying to throw something off. Dune's breaths were still ragged, his flanks fluttering, legs drawing up against his body in unconscious spasms. Ellie knelt between them, one hand on each neck. "You're safe," she whispered. "Nobody's going to hurt you now." It was close to midnight when the hum of the generator broke the desert stillness. She'd waited until the last possible moment to start it, and the fuel ration was tight. But the flashlight batteries were dying, and the pump in the water tank needed power. The first stuttering cough of the diesel engine cracked the night air. In the same heartbeat, Dune lurched sideways with a scream that tore up the back of Ellie's neck. He slammed into the wall head, striking the rough plywood so hard the boards shivered. His eyes rolled wild whites, showing breath exploding in frantic bursts. Ash reacted instantly, spinning on his forelegs, front hooves pounding the straw on a display that was half defense, half challenge. A sheen of sweat burst across his shoulders in seconds, the heat lifting a pungent tang into the room. Ellie swore, sprinting for the door. She hit the kill switch on the generator, and the deep quiet crashed back in, just their heaving breaths and the rattle of the straw under them. The beam of her flashlight caught Ash's head, snapping toward it, a pupil shrinking. He reared once, striking forward with both front hooves. The right kick caught the stall door just under the hinge, splintering the frame and sending the bottom latch spinning into the straw. Ellie didn't move toward him. She stepped inside but stayed low, settling cross-legged about 15 feet away. Her voice was slow, calm, resonant enough to cut through their panic. "No wires," she said. "No current. Nobody's touching your neck again." Ash's muscles bunched, then eased a fraction. He lowered his head but never looked away from her. Dune had folded back down to the straw, trembling so hard his teeth clicked audibly. Foam dripped from the corner of his mouth, staining the sand beneath. They stayed that way for several long minutes, the only sound the soft rasp of the wind on the tin roof. She reached for the radio this time, not bothering with her main line. The short-range channel had better luck, patchy, but enough to bounce a signal to the border med post. "I need Dr. Whitaker," she said when the operator picked up. "2 equines. Severe dehydration, possible heat stroke trauma. Immediate." The reply crackled, followed by a man's voice, "Jonah Whitaker." She ran through the symptoms, keeping it quick and clinical. On the other end, Jonah's tone sharpened. "Don't let them go more than 4 hours without stabilizing the heat stress," he said. "Keep the water coming slow and steady. I can be there in 45. The next 45 felt like a watchtower shift in a storm. Too much stillness, too much waiting. When the distant crunch of tires on gravel finally reached her ears, she was already at the door. The pickup rolled into the floodlight's edge, a dented Ford with a rack of battered gearboxes in the bed. Jonah stepped down, a rangy man in his 40s, with sun-seamed skin and the kind of hands that looked built to work. He carried a duffel in one hand and a hard plastic case in the other. Inside the storage room, his eyes went straight to Dune. He crouched, speaking softly as he opened the case. A slim diagnostic light swept across Dune's cornea, catching the slow reflex of the pupil. "He's responsive," Jonah murmured. "But hold him steady." Dune's head tilted away from the light, but he didn't strike. Jonah rolled back the skin over the jugular with 2 fingers, his thumb pausing over a faint bruise that circled the vein. "Not a single injection," he said. "Several. Repeated same site. That's continuous intravenous, not veterinary. Looks like they've been running stimulants." Ellie's stomach nodded. Jonah switched tools, running a portable RFID scanner over Dune's shoulder. It beeped sharply. The readout flashed a code she didn't recognize. Jonah's brows drew together. That's not USDA, not Fish and Wildlife, not Bureau of Land Management. Hell, it's not in any of the interstate tracking systems. Could be proprietary. Illegal, Ellie said flatly. Or worse, internal, Jonah replied. Ash was a different problem. When Jonah approached with the scanner, Ash recoiled so violently, the medicine table tipped sideways, scattering vials across the straw. Ellie stepped into the gap between them, palm out toward Jonah. Don't touch his neck, she warned. He reacts every time. Jonah eased back, studying from a crouch. The flashlight's beam caught on a patch of skin under the base of Ash's mane, a fresh scrape laid over an older scar. When Jonah shifted the angle, the outline emerged a capital R, stylized into a brand, its lines dulled and broken with age. He froze. I've seen that before. Back of the thigh on experimental goats in North Texas. Not anything you can do legally. Not even close. Ellie said nothing. She could feel Ash's breath on her shoulder, hot and steady, but taut as a wire. By the time Jonah finished the saline drips and secured the worst wounds, the night had deepened to that peculiar desert silence that makes you feel like the world has stopped just outside the walls. He packed his kit in silence until he reached the door. I don't know what you've stumbled into, he said, finally meeting her eyes. But these aren't wild Mustangs in the way you think. They're products. Somebody's project. He left without another word, the sound of his truck fading into the wind. Ellie stayed. She couldn't bring herself to climb the stairs to the narrow bunk room. Instead, she dragged a chair into the far corner of the storage room, just beyond the line where Ash's front hooves could reach. For a long time, neither horse moved. Ash stood with his head low, ears angled toward her in a way that felt more like appraisal than relaxation. Dune, at last, shifted onto his side, his breathing slower, steadier. It was only then that Ellie heard it faint, intermittent, almost like a dream leaking into the air. Dune was making tiny sounds between breaths, as if muttering in some language she couldn't understand. Outside, the desert wind picked up brushing sand against the windows in soft, dry whispers. Somewhere beyond that, she thought she heard the low, distant call of another horse. But when she listened harder, it was gone. She leaned back in the chair, the weight of Jonah's words settling like grit at the bottom of a canteen. Somebody's project. And now, it was hers. 2 mornings after the rescue, the desert light was softer than usual, no more than 90 degrees yet. But Ellie could already feel the heat pooling behind the rocks like a waiting predator. She parked the ATV 100 yards from the site, letting the engine tick into silence. The sand still held the memory of what had happened here. The shallow depressions where Ash and Dune's bodies had lain, the disturbed fringe of yucca that had been battered aside. The wind had done its best to erase the violence, but some things were too deliberate to be weather's work. From her pack, she pulled out the tools: a folding drone, no larger than a loaf of bread, a compact soil compression gauge, a handheld track imager. The drone lifted into the air with a muted whine, circling low in a widening spiral. As she followed on foot eyes, shifting between the live feed on her tablet and the ground in front of her, the ruts were still there, a set of deep tire impressions cutting straight into the valley and curling back out. They weren't on any patrol path or rancher's access trail. The tread pattern was distinctive, a zigzag bite heavy enough to compress the sand beneath the crust. Military grade or off-road specialty. Behind a cluster of mesquite, she found something stranger. A patch of earth flattened by more than wind or animal. Soil packed down in a geometric outline as if something heavy and rectangular had stood there. She pressed the gauge probe into it. The resistance was mechanical, not natural. A portable tent, a container set down for hours, maybe days. Farther along, 10 yards of desert floor had been dusted with a cover of brittle leaves, the wrong kind for this elevation. She swept a boot through them and found the surface beneath was mixed with fine gravel too clean to be random. The line ran straight toward the shadow of the western ridge, like a path someone had taken pains to disguise. She took her photos, tagged the coordinates, felt the first shift of the wind to the east. Time to go before the sun found her fully. Back at the station, she pulled the weather-scarred laptop from its case, flipped up the dish antenna, and waited for the satellite uplink to blink green. The email had been sitting in her archive for almost a year, from a woman she'd never met, but never quite forgotten, Callie Tran. Ellie typed a brief note, attached the photos and map data, and hit send. She didn't expect a quick answer. So when her screen flashed with an incoming video call less than 10 minutes later, she blinked. Callie's face appeared in the corner window, lit by the harsh fluorescence of what looked like a dingy internet cafe. Somewhere in Reno, if the background signage was right. Dark eyes sharp under the brim of a battered ball-cap voice, low and even. "You don't call unless you've got something," Callie said without greeting. "I've got something," Ellie replied, and laid it out: the rescue, the coordinates, the tire tracks, the disguised clearing. Callie's gaze sharpened with each image. She reached for her own keyboard, the clatter loud over the connection. "I've been building a database, satellite archives from the last 3 years. Some of it's private. A conservation group in Europe lets me borrow their eyes now and then." Ellie waited while the other woman worked, watching her scroll through aerial shots, dragging the view over the section Ellie had marked. 3 years ago, Callie said, tapping her screen, this spot had metal roofing. Long rectangle, maybe 60 feet. Tucked under the trees here, see? She zoomed in until the image pixelated the shadows, giving away the hard lines. And now it's gone. Or rather, now it's been buried under this. The current image bloomed on Ellie's screen, a dense, orderly patch of greenery, the leaves too uniform, too evenly spaced. "Planted," Ellie murmured. "Planted to cover something. Somebody wanted it off the map." And Callie leaned closer to her camera. Nothing disappears forever, not if you know where to look. That night, the desert was so quiet, it felt as if sound itself had been exiled. Ellie had finally drifted into a shallow doze in the cabin when a sharp metallic clink snapped her awake. She knew the sound instantly, a latch sliding. The next came softer but stranger, a low, deliberate scrape of hooves against sand, then the hollow beat of running steps. She threw on her jacket and grabbed the flashlight, the beam slicing the darkness as she ran to the makeshift stall. The door hung wide. A set of fresh hoofprints led up the slope behind the station. She followed them at a jog, lungs biting at the cool air. At the top in the moonlight stood Dune, head-high, mane lifting in the wind. When she reached him, he didn't bolt. He looked at her, then stomped, twice the sound sharp in the stillness. He turned his head west, took a few slow steps, stopped, and looked back as if waiting. Ellie took one step in the opposite direction. Dune didn't move. She turned back toward him, toward the west. He started walking again, measured, unhurried, always keeping the distance between them constant. They went on like that for 20 minutes, the land dropping and rising beneath their feet until the faint glow of the station lights marked their return. Without prompting, Dune walked straight back into the stall and folded himself down onto the straw. Ellie stood there, breathing hard, staring at him as if he might vanish. Horses didn't do that, not wild ones, not unless they'd been taught to move with humans as partners. The next morning, she decided to test a theory. Ash was standing near the gate of his enclosure, ears pricked toward her. She stopped about 10 feet away, squared her shoulders, and gave a sharp, firm halt. The hoof in mid-shift froze. Step. One front leg lifted, paused in the air, then settled forward half a pace. Back. He shifted his weight and stepped back just one stride controlled. Ellie felt the prickle at the back of her neck. This wasn't random mimicry. His ears had turned toward her voice, his eyes locking on her mouth, reading her. "You've been trained," she said softly. But trained for what? She didn't have an answer. She called Callie again instead, recounting exactly what she'd seen. The journalist exhaled sharply. "Last year I heard whispers about a program Colorado. Private. They were taking Mustangs, breaking them into something like war horses, selling to overseas buyers with deep pockets. But it was rumor. I could never get it confirmed. And if they were trained," Ellie said, "what happens when they're retired? Maybe they get sold." Or maybe Callie hesitated. Maybe they're buried in the sand and someone hopes no one ever finds them. That evening, Ellie climbed the narrow ladder to the cabin roof. The horizon to the west was a jagged bruise of rock and shadow, in the same direction Dune had faced the night before. The wind had picked up stroking lines of sand across the tin roof, with a sound like claws on wood. Below, Ash stood in the yard, his eyes half closed, but never fully. Dune lay still in the stall, on the slow rhythm of his breath occasionally interrupted by a twitch, a murmur that seemed too deliberate to be dreaming. Ellie jotted the patterns down in her notebook, her pen scratching against the paper. Each reaction, each glance, each sound. Not random. Not anymore. She leaned back, letting the cool air wash over her face, and let the questions spill into the open space above her. If a horse could follow commands, guide a human through the desert, and unlock its own stall in the dark, who had taught it? And where were they now, when their creations were being buried alive? The ranger station was no longer a safe house. It was an outpost on the edge of something deeper, darker. She took out the map. Callie had annotated the circle around the suspicious patch of regrowth in the west. She traced it with her fingertip until the paper crinkled under the pressure. Her voice was barely louder than the wind, but it was enough. "We're going," she told the darkness. Soon, the night had settled into that fragile stillness the desert sometimes allowed, a hush so complete that even the sigh of the wind sounded like an intrusion. Ellie sat at her desk, pen moving across the page in steady strokes as she recorded Ash's reactions to different sounds. He was calmer tonight, though his ears still twitched at noises too faint for her to hear. It was just after 11 when she caught the sound. A soft clink, almost polite, from the direction of the makeshift stalls. She looked up, eyes narrowing. The next sound was less subtle, the metallic scrape of a latch. Ellie was halfway across the yard when the stall door swung wide. Dune stepped out, not charging, not frantic, but with the measured confidence of an animal that knew exactly what it was doing. He turned his head toward her, gave a low, almost conversational nicker, and then moved into a slow lope toward the northwest. Ellie didn't even hesitate. She grabbed her flashlight, the small first aid kit, and the belt knife she kept for trail rescues. By the time she hit the edge of the compound's light, Dune was already a ghostly outline, a head mane flickering in the moonlight. She followed. The ground shifted under her boots from soft sand to a more uneven mix of stone and grit. The air cooled, sharpening in her lungs. Ahead, the land broke into jagged slabs, an old rockfall that marked the lip of a narrow canyon. Here, the sand bled into grayish soil, colder underfoot, as if the sun never quite touched it. The wind found a low whistle in the rocks, a sound that made the skin at the back of her neck tighten. Dune stopped at 20 meters ahead, head turned to watch her one front hoof tapping in a steady rhythm against the stone. Ellie slowed her steps, sweeping the flashlight in a wide arc. The beam passed over rock shadow, more rock, then caught something pale and wrong against the ground. An arm. human. It jutted from behind a boulder, fingers curled stiffly toward the earth. She was moving before she realized it, boots scraping on stone as she dropped to one knee beside the body. Not a body. Not yet. The man was alive, barely. He looked to be in his 40s, his face a swollen map of bruises and split skin. His shoulder was torn open in a jagged gash, the wound wrapped in a filthy strip of cloth already stiff with dried blood. "Hey," she said sharply, forcing her voice to cut through the wind. "Stay with me." His eyelids fluttered. When they opened, the whites were shot through with red, his gaze unfocused but searching. Ellie ran through the motions, checked the airway, 2 fingers to the carotid. Pulse faint but present. She dug in her kit for the glucose solution, got the cap between her teeth, and poured the liquid past his cracked lips. The man coughed once the sound raw in his chest, then tried to push himself upright. Pain stole the effort. He sagged back against the rock. "Don't move," Ellie ordered, one hand firm on his good shoulder. His voice came out in broken fragments, rasping like sandpaper. "I didn't make it out. They found us. Thermal scans. From the air." "Who?" she demanded. "Who was chasing you?" He blinked at her as if weighing the cost of the answer. "Names? Wade Kinlan. Used to drive transport. For Viridian Equine Research." Ellie's mind snagged on the name. She'd seen it once on the corner of a federal report about behavioral modulation research for wild mustangs. A minor contract and nothing remarkable. "Ridgun," she said. "That's a government?" Wade gave a short, humorless laugh that ended in a wet cough. Blood threaded from the corner of his mouth. "Ridgun's just the storefront," he said. "The real name's Ridgen. Joint venture private capital military oversight. Not in the brochures." She felt her pulse kick harder. What kind of venture? His eyes slid shut for a moment, and she thought he might be gone. But then he forced them open again. "Training horses. Not the rodeo kind. Combat models. We used sonic triggers, electrical pulses, reflex conditioning. Implant chips so you could steer them, voice command, tone modulation." Her stomach turned. "Steer them? Into what? Depends. Some were juiced with neurostims, made to react faster, hit harder. Guard animals you could ride through small arms fire. Others went to auction. Private buyers, warlords. I saw bids hit 300 grand for a matched pair." She shook her head. "That's insane. That's business." His gaze caught hers, something like shame flickering in the murk. "When a horse failed, when it couldn't hold the program, or fought back. We didn't take it apart for parts." Ellie's throat went dry. "What did you do?" "I was the one with the shovel." His voice was flat, dead weight between them. "We buried them. Alive. That way there's nothing left, no samples, no tags. Sand covers it quick. Takes a few hours." The breath she drew in tasted of rust and bile. Ash. Dune. "I didn't think any of them made it," Wade went on, voice fraying. "Some did. Some found their way back. But you don't get it, Ranger." His head rolled slightly on the rock and his eyes narrowing with a fevered intensity. "Those aren't horses anymore." Ellie took an involuntary step back, the words clawing at something primal inside her. "There are more," he whispered. "Dozens. Still inside." Her voice barely cleared her lips. Inside, where Wade's gaze drifted past her unfocused, now his breath shorter. And not just horses. Then his head lolled sideways, consciousness slipping away like water through fingers. She forced herself into motion, pulse still there, weaker. She dragged the emergency blanket from her pack, wrapped it tight around him, and bound his injured shoulder as best she could without making it worse. The rescue board was just a narrow plank she kept strapped to the ATV for small animal recovery. It would have to serve. Behind her, Dune still waited, head low, ears angled toward the canyon. "Good boy," she murmured, voice rough. "I don't know what you are anymore either, but I owe you." With the straps fastened, she began the slow, brutal process of dragging Wade back toward the station. The trek felt longer on the return, every step a reminder of the man's dead weight and her own growing fatigue. Half a mile from the yard, she thumbed the radio clip to her belt. "Jonah, it's Ellie. I need you at the station. Set up for trauma care, human not animal." There was a pause, then Jonah's voice crackled back sharper than usual. "Copy. How bad? Bad enough. And Jonah, no generators. No mechanical hum. Keep it dead quiet." Understood. She glanced back at Wade. Even unconscious, he wasn't still, his eyelids fluttered, lips shaping words that didn't quite make sound. Then one made it through a ragged whisper. "Don't start the engine." The hair along her arms lifted. The generator. She remembered Dune's and Ash's violent panic at its first ignition. If these animals were built to respond to certain frequencies, no. Not animals. Not anymore. They reached the station just after 3 in the morning, and the moon already hidden behind the jagged line of the ridge. Jonah was waiting, a med kit open beside him, eyes scanning Wade's condition with a clinical sweep, before helping Ellie maneuver him inside the small side cabin. "Pulse is thready," Jonah muttered. "We'll keep him here warm, him fluid, slow." Ellie only nodded. Across the yard, Ash had moved to the edge of his stall, one ear fixed toward the sound of their voices. It wasn't random. His ear wasn't tracking Jonah. It was tracking Wade. Dune settled in the straw, but his head remained upright, eyes turned west toward the shadowed land where Wade had come from. Ellie crossed to her desk and laid the regional map flat. She uncapped a red pen, wrote 2 words in block letters so dark they almost tore the paper, buried alive. She circled the rectangle of replanted forest Callie had shown her on the satellite images. Somewhere in there were more, maybe still breathing, maybe not. She looked up at Jonah, her decision already made. "We can't wait. If they're still alive, every minute matters. And if they weren't, then whoever had done this might be erasing the rest even now." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest edge of distant metal on metal like a gate in the dark. Ellie didn't remember when sleep had become a rumor. By the 4th night, it felt like an old address she couldn't find on a map. She knew it existed, had been there once. Could almost picture the stoop, but every time she tried to go back, the desert said no. Wind scraped the station like a dull blade, hissing through the seams of the window frames, setting the glass drumming with sand in a steady, arrhythmic meter. The red utility lamp she'd strung over the storage room threw a low wash of color across straw and skin-flattening shadows until the whole scene looked as if it were happening underwater. Dune kept jerking in his sleep. Not a startle and settle. A full-body flinch that pulled his head sideways, then a soft, pain-born whicker that tightened something between Ellie's shoulders. She'd seen horses dream twitching hooves, a quiet snort, the casual spasm of muscle that said the mind had found a meadow. This wasn't that. Every sound out of Dune felt like a memory tearing. Ash, on the other hand, refused the idea of rest. He planted himself at the stall entrance with his muzzle toward the yard ears, pivoting like finely tuned instruments, body so still, the red light painted him into a statue. For 3 hours, he didn't shift a hoof. Ellie watched the pattern, the periphery scans, the hold, the micro-turn of an ear toward the faintest scuff. She'd seen sentries in the Marine stand like that on a flight line, and Hellman's stillness wound tight around the possibility of violence. If Dune was trapped inside what had been done to him, Ash was braced for it to return. She leaned against the door jamb, arms crossed against the night chill that seeped under the metal roof. The words formed without permission, as plain and cruel as they felt true. "One of you dreams of torture," she said quietly. "The other's ready to kill whatever comes near." Ash's eye slid to her, a dark disk, taking her in and returning unblinking. Under the red lamp, the wild look she expected wasn't there. It had burned out days ago. What remained was focus, purpose. There was a habit behind his gaze, a shape to the way he waited that said orders had once been a language he understood intimately. She sat on the stool and wrote what she could stand to name. Under red light, Ash exhibits sustained hypervigilance without agitation. Not wild, trained alertness. The wind knocked once sharply on the generator shed. The room held its breath. Then Dune exhaled a long, trembling slide back into uneasy quiet, and Ash turned his muzzle a fraction toward the sound, as if classifying it, shelving it, letting it live. In the gray tilt before dawn, Ellie decided to stop guessing and ask the simplest question the way you'd ask a soldier, direct and testable. She strung a length of rope between two posts in the yard. To sketch a narrow lane, set a couple of soft posts at either end, enough of a frame to read responses without threatening them. The horizon bled from steel to a watery yellow as she clipped the gate. Dune stepped out first when she swung the stall door, blinking into the brightness. He followed the sweep of her hand out into the lane with surprising willingness, ears flicking back toward Ash, until he had the measure of the space. Ash came after, not crowding her, not trying to edge past, simply moving into position, as if an old groove had presented itself and he'd slid back into it. Ellie stopped 3 meters from Ash and let her body find the kind of command posture she hadn't worn since training season years ago. Feet under hips, shoulders, squared voice, neither pleading nor loud, but definitive. Halt. Ash froze. The instantness of it stopped her breath. All 4 legs locked into a quiet, balanced brace. Not the stiff brace of fear, a trained hold. Step. 1 foreleg lifted and set down. Not a scramble, not a lunge. A single measured advance. Ash kept his head aligned with her chest, eyes on her mouth. Back. He shifted his weight to the hindquarters and eased back 2 strides, still facing forward, still locked on her, like her lips were the metronome of the world. Ellie swallowed and felt heat move behind her eyes in a way that irritated her. Emotion under observation was a luxury. She turned to Dune, switching gears the way you modulate for a greener partner. Halt. He stopped. A half beat late, but he obeyed. Step. He hesitated, then obliged, nose-dipping muscles registering the meaning more than the word. Back. He thought about it, and then, trusting the hand signal more than the syllable, yielded. Slow, careful, not wrong. Ellie varied the pitch of her commands, pitched one high, one fast, one clipped, and watched both horses follow, if imperfectly. She dropped to a whisper and saw only Ash respond, ear flicking forward, body coiling and uncoiling on whispers alone. She drew the small field notebook from her pocket and squatted in the dirt. 3 commands executed precisely by Ash. Delayed compliance by Dune. Both respond to tone and cadence. Whisper level effective on Ash only. She looked up over the page at Ash and said, because it felt useless to pretend otherwise, "You were trained." The wind moved through his mane. He didn't blink, trained for what she asked, but that was for herself, for the map in her head that was starting to connect red thread lines into places she didn't want to go. By late morning, Jonah had made it back with what he called the ugly kit, a Pelican case of readers and boards, and a software stick he shouldn't have owned. He rolled out a length of rubber matting in the storage room. and had Ash stand with one foreleg on it the way you'd cue a dog to a placeboard. No ties, no pressure, just a request, wrapped in an expectation. "Let's see what your history says, friend," he murmured, keeping his movements small. He produced a handheld scanner and moved it slowly over Ash's shoulder, careful to avoid the neck. The device chirped. The screen lit with a code that meant nothing to Ellie and everything to Jonah. "Triple-layer encryption," he said. "Military K9 chips run 2 layers on the deployment units I've seen. This has a third, and the radio handshake pattern's different." He glanced up. "You can reassign it." "Reassign," Ellie echoed. "Yeah. Most working dogs are bonded to a single handler's voice profile and a limited set of tones. Whoever built this reprogrammed the logic to accept multiple profiles, multiple voices. That's not about identity. That's about command resilience." He shifted to the laptop, running the cable from the reader into a small black dongle and then to the machine. Lines of text scrolled. "There's a temporary buffer. See this? This is not just an ID chip. It's a reflex router. You can push patterns right over them, train in fast forward if you don't care about what you break." He sat back on his heels, looking older than he had an hour ago. "If this is a prototype, I don't want to see the production version." "What about Dune?" Ellie asked. Jonah scanned him too. Another beep. Another foreign sequence. Same manufacturer, different firmware build. "He's not as tight as your gray boy here, but he's been through the same system." He tapped a line on the screen. "Temporary memory logging. That's where you'd batch commands from multiple trainers and see what sticks." Ellie's mouth had gone dry. She had thought of Ash as an edge case, an animal who'd survived something monstrous. Jonah's report said he was a product with a version number. "So they don't just track them," she said. "They run them," Jonah answered. She thought of the generator thumping alive and the way Dune had exploded into the wall. She thought of Wade's broken whisper, "Don't start the engine," and the list of frequencies she didn't know how to hear. Jonah closed the laptop. "I can pull a copy of what's here for evidence, but we need to be careful. If anyone's still listening, we don't ping the network harder than we have to. Anyone who ever built the system, whoever's still using it." She thought of the replanted rectangle on Callie's satellite images, its leaves too neat, its edges too right. The decision to call the feds felt like opening a door and inviting whatever stood outside to put its hand on her chest. Ellie climbed the tower ladder anyway. On the top platform, the world widened in a way that would have been beautiful if she weren't about to dial work into war. The secure line for state to federal contacts still lived in her phone like an emergency contact you hoped never to use. The ring was short. The voice that answered was male neutral. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. "Secure extension. This is Ranger Elena Marlowe, Nevada Division," she said, giving her badge number, her station code, the dead noon cadence of a person who had already decided. "I need to report animal cruelty of a federal nature violation of multiple statutes, potentially involving interstate transport and experimental devices." The line shifted. "Hold for verification." 30 seconds later, "Connect to Agent Reese Lormont." A new voice came on, slow, deliberate, skeptical by default. "Reese." Ellie kept it short because the truth didn't need adjectives. "I found 2 juvenile Mustangs buried alive in Desolation Ridge. Rescued them. They have embedded chips not recognized by any national registry. Behavioral responses indicate tactical conditioning. I have a live witness, Wade Kinlan, who drove for a group fronting as Ridgen Equine Research. He says the real program is called Ridgen. He says they buried failed animals alive to destroy evidence." There was silence. Not the polite kind. The kind that listens to see if you'll blink. Ranger Reese said finally, level as a shooting bench, you understand the weight of what you're alleging. I understand 2 horses with human-made hardware in their bodies. I understand a man bleeding on my floor who knew how to find my station because a horse led me to him. If this is a private facility gone sideways, 3-layer encrypted chips with temporary memory logs she cut in. Repurposed K9 protocols, a brand on the neck in the shape of a stylized R, and the name Ridgen. Does any of that sound like a mom-and-pop outfit to you? 8 seconds. She counted them because it felt important to know what silence costs. When Reese spoke again, his voice had changed temperature. Send me your coordinates. Do not transmit anything else on any unsecured channel. I'll be there in 18 hours. You know the name, she said softly. Ridgen. I used to, he said. If what you have is what I think it is, a breath, it won't just be horses. The line clicked dead. Ellie stared at the horizon like it might answer the question hanging in her chest. It didn't. The desert just breathed its dry breath and watched her climb down. She set the phone beside the ledger and stood a long moment, hands flat on the scarred wood of the desk, until the shake in them decided to leave. When it did, it left a steadier thing in its place. Resolve didn't make her safer, but it made the size of the danger clearer. Ash had moved closer to the inner rail, as if proximity were a choice he'd just decided to make. He stood not quite facing her, his profile carved against the dim, his nostrils flaring with each slow intake, as if sampling the air of her decision. Eavesdropping, she asked him a smile that felt nothing like a smile, heading for her mouth and then thinking better of the trip. He flicked an ear toward her voice. Dune, exhausted by his own nightmares, had folded himself into a child's version of rest legs, tucked chin on the straw. Now and then, his lips worked as if he were mouthing a word he didn't have. Ellie opened the ledger and wrote not because she needed a record for court, but because naming things helped keep the edges from fraying Agent Reese Lormont inbound. Evidence chips cloned, brand documented, witness present. Protocol keep generator off to avoid acoustic triggers. Station on low profile. Thunder murmured from somewhere so far away, it felt like a rumored desert of thunder, the kind that announces storms that never arrive. It crawled along the bones of the place anyway, lighting something electrical in her blood. She checked the locks she could trust, the deadbolts, the steel bar across the back door, and ignored the ones she couldn't, like the fragile wood of the stall that Ash had nearly kicked off its hinges at the first growl of the generator. She topped off the lamp oil, trimmed the wick, and unholstered her sidearm onto the runner she used for cleaning. The ritual was old enough to be comforting. Cloth solvent motion, the click of metal on the bench like punctuation marks. If fear came, she let it come. She had room for it alongside the stubborn, ordinary acts of preparation. She paused, glanced toward the yard, and spoke aloud because sometimes saying a thing made the body remember it better. No generator. Keep it dark. Keep it quiet. Keep them calm. Wine-feathered sand against the sill like a hand testing a locked door. She thought of Reese's voice and the way it had rearranged itself around the word Ridgen. She thought of Callie in a battered ball cap inside a humming internet cafe. She thought of Wade breathing like a man who had earned and lost too much of it. She slid the slide home and rested the pistol across her knees, the lamp a soft orange pulse in the periphery. Tomorrow won't be quiet, she told the room. Ash shifted just once, the minimal consent of a soldier who already knew. Dune's breath deepened for the first time that night. A full lung, a full exhale, and the kind of silence that followed it wasn't empty at all. It was a held note waiting for the downbeat. Reese Lormont arrived just after sunrise, the desert already breathing heat like an animal that had slept with one eye open. He stepped down from the SUV in a white shirt and a sun-guard vest, mirrored sunglasses cutting the glare so completely Ellie could see herself inside their lenses, small, dust-streaked, at once relieved and aware of how everything she'd said on the phone now had to survive daylight. He didn't look like a hero or a villain, just a man whose expressions had been sanded to fine, unreadable edges by too many years of listening to people lie. He offered a nod instead of a handshake, then glanced past Ellie to the yard. 4 others fanned out from the vehicles with the matter-of-fact economy of people who worked in places that did not welcome them. Omar De Leon, tall and quiet, carried a case with LIDAR stickers and a battered tablet tucked under his arm. His face was all angles and patience, the kind of scientist who let the landscape confess at its own pace. 2 agents from FWS Tactical Light Armor carbines slung but safetied the weight of their gear, arranged to suggest they hoped not to use it. And Trung Leung, a compact, deliberate engineer in a gray ball cap, the strap of a Pelican case digging into her shoulder where the stenciled words biotelemetry were just visible. "We're not going in to shoot anyone," Reese said, voice level, as if he were writing the parameters of the day on the air. "We're going to prove something that shouldn't exist." Ellie handed him the printouts, Callie's satellite overlays, her annotated map, and the coordinates she could recite in her sleep now. Behind her, the stall doors stood open. Ash and Dune were already outside without having been asked, standing parallel to the lead ATV like a pair of rangy, impossible bookends waiting for the day to begin. Reese's gaze snagged on them. "Do they still take orders?" Ellie didn't look at the horses when she answered. "They don't need orders. They remember the way."
Cool.
They left the vehicles in the lee of the ridge and went on foot. Engines would have been faster, but speed wasn't the point now. Noise and vibration were. The desert swallowed cars when it wanted to. What it refused to eat was the footfall of something careful. Ash and Dune moved ahead at an easy, deliberate walk, both of them reading the ground like a sentence they'd learned in a former life. Ellie trailed them with Reese at her shoulder, the FWS agents a silent triangle behind. Omar stayed a few paces off, watching his tablet. While he walked the device connected to a slim LiDAR unit, he swept in the slow arcs, the way you might dust furniture. They skirted a patch of broken stone where a rockfall had sheared the earth like a bad haircut, past low acacia, hunched like crouching men, and stepped over a set of tire imprints so old they were more memory than mark, unless you'd seen them fresh, unless you knew how to look along the surface for the places the crust had been broken and then patted back into place. Omar said nothing for the first mile, his brow knitting and smoothing as he toggled between past and present. Then he angled the tablet so Ellie could see. The live LiDAR feed was overlaid with a ghost of the old ground, a computational hallucination of the desert as it had been 10 years ago. Beneath the rippling skin of sand, a faint geometry appeared, faint ribs of fence line parallel dark threads of pipe. And here and there, the suggestion of rectangles sunk into the earth like the bones of shipping containers. "Not a camp," he murmured half to himself. "It's a network. Ant farm on its side." Ellie felt her mouth go dry. She didn't say what she was thinking, that networks didn't die easy. They calcified. They waited. The wind rose around them, pushing grit along the ground in thin, urgent rivers. Ash lifted his head. Dune flicked an ear and kept walking. They slowed near the first line of evenly spaced acacia, the green almost obscene against the tan. Ellie raised a hand, and the formation compressed, everyone sinking into a shape that let their eyes work. Behind the screen of trees, a strand of barbed wire sat, half swallowed by sand, the top 2 lines barely visible, the bottom line buried. Omar nudged a stick toward it. The stick quivered and popped as if it had been offended. Trung crouched held a small wand near the wire and frowned. Low-frequency current, she said. Not tuned for human gait. Quadruped deterrent. Keep your knees off the ground, one of the FWS agents said dryly, and the other smiled without any humor in it. Omar pointed with his chin. At eye level in the bole of the nearest acacia, a hollow had been carved, then disguised with bark and clay. Inside, a thermal camera blinked an ancient, stubborn red, obsolete but awake. Someone forgot to die, Omar said. Ellie moved past him to the container, half drowned in sand. The door sat within a steel frame, the glossy scar of a biometric plate bolted over and ripped out. No keyhole, no handle. A set of metal steps, barely more than nubbed grips, rose from the sand to the jam. She dug a finger into one tread and came away with a smear of clean dust. No wind, no time had had a chance to fill it. Hours, Reese said, looking at the tread, not days. A breath later, the desert gave them an answer it had been holding. From somewhere under the green and the sand came a sound like a torn bellows, a long, ragged whinny dragged up from a chest that had run out of other ways to speak. It wasn't the sharp alarm of domestics. It was a call and a demand woven together. We are here. Come. Ash's entire frame went rigid muscles, pulling his skin tight over his ribs. Eyes haloed white. Then he lowered his head slightly and answered with a sound Ellie had never heard from him before. Deep, definite, full of the kind of authority that didn't ask. In the pause that followed, 3 or 4 other noises came back through the earth, and the leaves metal against metal, a hoof on steel, a desperate, muffled chorus. They're alive, Ellie said. The words were almost accusation, almost prayer. Dune hammered one forehoof into the sand in a quick, insistent tattoo, then swung his head toward Reese and fixed him there, steady and unblinking. You. Decide. Reese scanned the tree line and the shadows and all the ways a trap could be set here. When he spoke, it was flat final. This is the place, and someone's already started cleaning it. They fell back to the edge of a wash and let the plan take shape in short sentences and pointed fingers. Reese pointed at the camouflaged camera. We assume there are more inside. Faces down, lights red only. Omar, mark underground access points. We'll prioritize the one closest to that call. Omar ran the LiDAR, again tagged 3 candidate squares with quick, efficient taps. This one, he said, pointing to the container Ellie had just touched. There's a dead space behind it. Void looks engineered. Trang set a puck on the sand near the container and watched her handheld fill with lines. 17 live microchip signals within 50 yards, she said. 15 have familiar modulation patterns. 2 are broadcasting in a format I've never seen. Reese's glance slid to Ellie. They're not in any registry, Ellie said quietly. They never were. Reese nodded once, as if they were all finally speaking the same language. We go at 2100. If they survived what I've heard then, I want both horses at the front when we go in. Ellie didn't trust herself to look at him. She kept her eyes on the planted trees where no breeze moved. I don't think they're just horses anymore. They waited in the lee of the ridge until the sun loosened its hold and the shadows ran long. Sweat dried on their necks and left salt. Time rearranged itself into checks and murmurs, and the metallic whisper of equipment being reminded what its parts were called. No light but red. No voices above the wind. Omar's electromagnetic spoofer sat like a lunchbox at the container's base, its antenna tucked under the ripped biometric plate. He hummed once, an old habit Ellie guessed, and keyed a sequence into the pad that she could not have repeated if her life had depended on it. For a full second, nothing happened. Then the lock thunked in a way that suggested someone somewhere had approved. The doors shivered and opened in a short, grudging arc. Reese lifted a finger. The team slid forward, blacking out their lenses, flipping their headlamps to the dullest red they could stand. Ash and Dune took the first steps down the steel grate stairs, as if the angle and the echo belonged to them, as if their bodies had remembered this descent the same way a hand remembers a tool. The air below was the kind that lives forever, thick with iron and old disinfectant, and the sweet sour of animals who have been asked to live too long inside walls. The corridor split and split again, each branch bordered by welded wire, each wire bent in the exact same places by the exact same hooves. Emergency lights pulsed dull red every 15 feet, throbbing like capillaries. In those beats, Ellie saw the world strobe the flash of a chart on the wall, with reflex boosting, cortical override, PFC blocks scrawled across an anatomical sketch. The glint of a ceiling-mounted device with contacts extended like a crown of thorns. The umbilical lines of cables dropping from conduit to cages where animals stood too still. This isn't training, Reese said, barely loud enough to qualify as sound. This is central nervous system sabotage. Trang's fingers moved across a control panel like a pianist forced to play a broken bar. External controllers offline. Whoever was here pulled the plug when they left. We're running on backwash and emergency power. Ash paused at a gate and lifted his head, a sound below a sound curling up out of him, something like comfort or command. In the cage beyond, a gray mare with raw patches around her ears blinked and swayed. Ellie stepped forward, kept her hands visible, and spoke like a metronome. Halt. Back. The mare's eyes sharpened. She didn't back up, not fully, but the fight left her face in a way Ellie knew too well. Not surrender. Recognition. Omar's whisper slid along the wall. Count them. They counted 18 living bodies across 3 zones. 6 with clean lines where implants had been mounted and removed scars white against dark hide. 7 thin, burned in splashes, and Ban's ribs laddered like old fences animals who'd been filed under problem and left to wait out the rest. 5 small ones' legs, too spindly for this place, penned separate like seeds in a cold room. Necks full, written in block letters over their stalls. Trung found the server closet by the footprint of heat on her handheld. The door protested. She ignored it. Racks hummed softly, the low murmur of machines, certain they would be listened to. She jacked in and started copying everything they would give her without a fight. On the second rack, a sticky note in neat block letters, M04 and M05 lost in field. In the directory structure, an echo of the same M04 and M05 flagged in a column labeled Status Escaped. Those are your boys, she said, without looking up. They came from here, and they left the right way. Ellie set her jaw and nodded once, because there were no words that wouldn't float up and drown. Somewhere in the ventwork above a clatter. Footsteps, not theirs. Company one of the FWS agents murmured, tilting his head toward a door at the far end of the corridor. Ellie had already turned when the server room lights dipped and a plume of smoke rolled through the gap under the door behind Trung. Stop him, he's wiping the drives, Trung snapped, choking back a cough. Ellie hit the hall at a run. A figure ghosted in the smoke, a man in gray coveralls with a mask slung at his neck arm, already up to throw a second canister. She saw the motion before she saw the face and raised her weapon without thinking. He winged the canister blind. It bounced, hissed, spread another layer of gray. He bolted for a crash bar at the corridor's end. The door clapped once, and darkness beyond inhaled him. Ash Ellie shouted, not giving herself the time to wonder what she was doing. Back hold go. The gray gelding launched like a shell leaving a barrel. He ran the corridor with his head low, slid through the door before it finished swinging, and vanished into the din of the air handling shaft beyond. Don't let him go alone. Reese barked, but Ash was already gone. Ellie and Reese pushed after him up a set of stairs that fed into a narrow cut between two long concrete rooms, then out into a hewn seam in the rock where sand had blown in and made a treacherous ramp. The man's footprints veered, stumbled corrected. At the top, the sky had become a shallow bowl full of smoke and starlight. The runner went left. Ash took the high side of the path, cutting him off at the turn the way a good cattle horse takes an angle off instinct and law. The man slid cursed Claude for a grip. He yanked a pistol free and brought it up by reflex. Ash didn't strike at the gun hand. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest like a linebacker kept his hooves perfectly under him and shouldered the body into the wall hard enough to make the cave mouth cough dust. The pistol flew. The man tried to scream and lost the air to do it. He sagged eyes up in that weird moment when a person tries to figure out if he'll be dead or arrested. Ellie reached them before his decision arrived. She kicked the pistol away and put a knee between his shoulder blades to keep him with the floor. When she looked up, Ash had already stepped back to give her room something dangling from his mouth like a trophy. She took it laminated card on a nylon lanyard, a stylized R nested inside a gear. A name under it she didn't recognize. A photo that would make a jury dislike the man, even before he opened his mouth. Good boy, she said, and realized she meant it in about 5 different languages at once. She had the man cuffed and handed to the agent by the time the second alarm reached her. A thin, crushed bell sound she knew now meant more than panic. Ellie ran back down, through heat and metal and red light. Dune was missing from where she'd left him. She found him by the noise, the hollow bang of a door being battered by a living thing with just enough mass to make a difference, but not enough leverage to win without help. Neck's foal hung crooked over the corridor. Dune braced his chest against a gate and shoved hooves, skating lips peeled back, around a sound that was not a threat so much as a promise to keep trying until the world moved. Beyond him, a light-boned foal the color of pale sand wobbled and worked its mouth at air eyes, rolling to the whites. On the ground beside a human boot, a syringe with a sheared cap needle bare the amber smear on its interior, catching red light and returning it ominously. Back, Ellie said, bringing her weapon up as a figure rounded into her lane of sight. At the end of the run, a technician in a lab apron. His face awash of fight-or-flight chemicals and bad decisions. He had another syringe in his hand. He raised it halfway, not like a weapon, but like a threat anyway. Stop, she said the word, an iron bar. Put it down. He glanced at Dune, at the foal at Ellie at the intersection behind her, where he must have known someone with cuffs and authority was about to appear. This is a protocol sample, he said, as if arguing with a peer. It's data. You don't. Reese came up on his right, as if the man had constructed that exact sentence to summon him. He took the syringe from the man's hand and set it neatly on a cart, then turned the man's wrist gentle as a dance teacher until the elbow found the wall. The cuffs made a polite sound. You just got saved by a baby horse, he said, not looking at the man as he read him his rights. Dune lowered his shoulder and slid the latch off the foal's gate enough that Ellie could reach it. When she stepped in, the foal flinched so hard it almost folded. Ellie crouched, let the foal find her hand with its nose. Its breath came in short, elastic bands. It didn't know where to put its legs yet. Dune reached through the bars and touched the foal's forehead with the flat of his muzzle, an ancient gesture with more science in it than any lab here had ever practiced. It's okay. Ellie whispered. We see you. We see you. In the end, there were only 5 humans left inside to arrest. Some had minor bruises and a case of shock that would set in the second the metal left their wrists. None of them fought like people who believed in this place past today. Omar dumped the server's data onto drives with a calm that would have read as boredom if you didn't know how rare it was to catch a machine in the act of remembering. Trung stood in a corner with her scanner held out like a divining rod, taking readings off shoulders and withers and the soft places behind elbows, recording modulation patterns like stolen heartbeats. An hour after the last gate opened, a light helicopter came shouldering through the night from the east, a dragonfly crane with a vet hanging out the side. Jonah hit the ground and moved like he'd been built to walk through this, his hands gentle or fierce as each situation required. He slid IV lines and splints into places that said yes to healing if asked with respect. When the last padlock hit the floor, Ellie stepped into the open space and realized how loud silence could be when a lot of lives had been held in it. They didn't bolt. They didn't stampede. The 18 came out in 2s and 3s, blinking, leaning into the idea of air. Then found a rough half circle without speaking to each other about it, and faced Ellie ears forward, bodies in a posture that, in another species, might have been called attention. Reese watched from the peripheral shadow of a doorway, his arms crossed against whatever this was doing to his face. They're not waiting for orders, he said quietly. They're waiting for you to say it's over. Ellie tried to swallow around a throat that had done too much work in the last hour. She took one step forward and let the words find their shape. Go, she said. You're free. It wasn't a speech. It didn't need to be. Freedom is a door. You either open it or you don't. 2 of the burned ones moved first, as if the idea had weight and they were willing to be brave enough to carry the front. The others followed in lines that weren't lines into a night that had room for them again. Some peeled off toward the cut in the rock and the thin promise of cold water. Some hung back, clustering around Ash and Dune like recruits, waiting for the sergeants who would walk the perimeter with them one more time. Reese came to stand beside Ellie. They'll fight this in court, he said, the first hint of ferocity threading his voice. They'll call it an off-books research initiative and say a contractor went rogue. But with this, he lifted the drive Omar had handed him. This will be enough. He looked out at the huddle of living shapes, at the way one foal pressed itself against Dune's shoulder, like a ship easing alongside a dock. You want to keep some as living evidence? Ellie shook her head. They don't need us to translate what happened. They already know. Let them decide what their lives look like now. Ash circled behind the group and took station in the rear, like a rear guard. Dune walked flank to the foal, his stride shortened in that funny, careful way big horses adopt for small companions. Jonah adjusted a sling under the belly of a mare with a broken leg and murmured something to her that sounded like an apology. They wanted war horses, he said to nobody in particular, tightening the strap. What they built was gatekeepers. The compound was gone. In the month since the raid, the last traces of Ridgeon's presence at Desolation Ridge had been dismantled piece by piece. The camera masts were pulled from their concrete moorings, the electrified fencing stripped and coiled away, the underground cabling yanked out of the sand like veins from a carcass. What remained was wind-open sky and the low, unbroken hum of a land reclaiming itself. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services had taken formal possession of the site. The scar left by the compound was already being reimagined, a new 250-acre sanctuary, seeded with native shrubs, hardier desert grasses, and a trickle of clean water from an artificial spring. Shallow gullies had been carved to mimic the natural drainage of the ridge, leading to a pool where wild pronghorn might one day drink beside mustangs without fear. Ash and Dune now lived there, along with the surviving horses from the underground pens. No fences penned them in, no bits or bridles, no steel shoes, no heavy halters. Only a thin leather collar, each fitted with a soft signal tracker, so Jonah could locate them during his weekly rounds. Some of the other mustangs had been moved to rehabilitation centers, their bodies too damaged for the harsh desert. But Ash and Dune had recovered quickly, muscle and spirit knitting back together with a quiet, guarded confidence. When Jonah arrived on Thursdays, Dune would break from whatever she was doing to meet him halfway across the pasture, sniffing at his pockets for the apple slices she knew he carried. Ash kept his distance. He watched from the crest of a low rise, ears swiveling eyes, never leaving Jonah's hands, not out of fear, but with the wariness of something that had learned long ago the cost of letting its guard drop. Ellie had been offered a promotion, a desk at the county's conservation oversight office, with a team under her and a salary big enough to cover her mortgage twice over. She'd said no without thinking. This ridge was where she'd stay. Here she could walk the fence line herself, check the spring's flow with her own hands, keep her own journal of sightings and changes in the wind. She didn't want memos. She wanted hoofprints. Callie Tran's article hit the wire 2 weeks after the raid. It sprawled across 22 pages in Wild Watch Journal, an investigative piece stitched from leaked documents, photographed maps, anonymous testimonies, and a few shadowed shots of the dismantled compound. The title sat in bold serif above it all, "The Desert That Breathed Again." Callie had traced Ridgeon back through 4 front companies, 2 of which were linked to private military contracts in the Middle East. The paper trail suggested that the behavioral modulation research on mustangs had begun as an experiment in remote scouting units, living assets, that could cross terrain where no drone or wheeled vehicle could follow. Guided not by reins, but by pulses of sound and neural cues. Some of the horses, Callie revealed, had been tested in live operations in Afghanistan. Their handlers never came forward. The deployments never appeared on any official manifest. Public outrage was immediate. The hashtag #NotJustHorses flooded feeds and timelines. Videos from animal rights groups spliced Callie's findings with archival footage of wild herds running free, overlaid with the question, "Where does instinct end and weapon begin?" Petitions circulated. Lawmakers, cornered by the uproar, were forced to issue statements condemning any research that undermines the humane treatment of wildlife. Ellie's name never appeared in the piece. In Callie's telling, she was simply Ranger E. A shadow at the edge of the story, neither hero nor witness, but the hinge on which it turned. Still, anyone who knew the ridge, or the woman who patrolled it, could read between the lines. It was just after dawn, and when the sanctuary's motion sensor tripped. Ellie had been halfway through a mug of coffee, the steam curling past the corner of her field notebook, when the small green light on the monitor began to pulse. She set the mug down, pulled the binoculars from their hook, and stepped to the window. In the wide clearing just beyond the scrub, Ash was moving, circling a bare patch of ground, not frenzied, not grazing. The pattern was deliberate, almost ritual, each turn punctuated by a sudden sharp snort. Ellie slid the window open. The wind carried the faint thud of hooves, steady and insistent. By the time she stepped outside, Dune was waiting at the inner fence line. She struck her hoof 3 times against the packed dirt, an old signal Ellie hadn't seen in weeks, one the mare had used during those first tense days to call her toward something unseen. The morning air was cool but rising toward heat. Ellie unlatched the gate. Neither horse hesitated. Ash wheeled toward the West Ridge dune, falling into step behind him, tails flicking in perfect unison. Ellie followed, keeping her distance. She didn't carry the tranquilizer rifle, didn't carry the recall device the agency required. She knew today wasn't about control. Not today, she murmured to herself. The climb to the ridge was slow, the horses taking a switchback path through the sandstone shelves. From the crest, Ellie could see the basin spread below a patchwork of shadow and gold as the sun tipped higher. Ash stopped first. He turned his head toward her, holding her gaze for a long breath. Then he lifted his muzzle and let out a deep, resonant call. The sound struck the cliff face opposite and came back doubled, rolling down into the desert, like a challenge or a promise. From beyond the ridge shapes emerged 8, maybe 9 Mustangs, their coats in every shade of dust and light. She recognized a few from the sanctuary, others she hadn't seen since the raid. They moved together without crowding a loose V that folded around Ash as he stepped forward. There was no looking back. Ash broke into a canter, the others following. Dust rose and hung in the morning sun like smoke. Dune lingered. The mare's head was high, ears flicking, eyes locked on Ellie. The rising light caught in the dark of her gaze, sharpening it, grounding it. Ellie felt the weight of that look, not wild, not tame, but something chosen. You know the way, Ellie said quietly. Dune's ears tipped forward. Then she turned, muscles bunching, and ran, catching the tail of the herd as they curved into the shimmering distance. Ellie stayed where she was until the dust settled. The ridge was silent, except for the hiss of the wind against the stones. She could still see the faint tremor in the air where the herd had passed, the warmth of their hoof prints radiating through the ground beneath her boots. She crouched and pressed her palm to the nearest print, feeling the lingering heat of the animal that had made it. Sand clung to her skin, fine as ash. The path they'd taken led toward the far horizon, into a part of the map still marked as unsurveyed territory. The kind of space that didn't belong to people, not even on paper. When she returned to the cabin, the air inside was cooler, still holding the scent of coffee gone cold. She sat at the small desk, opened the leather-bound notebook she'd been filling for months, and found the last blank page. Her pen moved slowly, the words deliberate. For a month I thought I'd save them. But this morning I understood. They never needed saving. They only needed us to stop hurting them. She signed her name full, not just initials, and closed the cover. Beside the notebook, the small digital recorder blinked in and stand by. She pressed the red button, spoke the same words aloud, and let the silence after them stretch. When she stopped the recording, the screen lit briefly before going dark. File locked, not for release. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest echo of a distant whinny, so thin and far it might have been memory. Ellie leaned back in her chair, eyes on the line of the ridge, and let it fade.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.